On the morning of September 19, 1944, a German engineering officer named Hauptmann Werner Kessler stood at the entrance of a stone farmhouse on the outskirts of Nijmegen, in the southern Netherlands, and did not go inside. He had been sent there by his divisional commander with a specific order: assess what the Americans left behind, document everything, photograph what you can, report back by nightfall. Kessler was 34 years old. He had been an engineer before the war, a structural engineer from Stuttgart who had designed bridges and railway stations, and once, in what felt like another lifetime, a small hospital annex in the Black Forest town of Freudenstadt. He knew buildings. He knew what a medical facility looked like, what it required, what it cost, and what it revealed about the people who built it. He had seen German field hospitals. He had seen Soviet ones. He had walked through a British casualty clearing station outside Caen 2 months earlier and found it competent, organized, and exactly what he expected a British institution to look like: precise, functional, slightly austere. He had not expected this. The farmhouse and the 2 large canvas structures erected beside it had been a forward surgical hospital belonging to the 44th Evacuation Hospital, United States Army. It had been operating less than 48 hours ago. The Americans had pulled out quickly, ahead of a German counterattack that had temporarily recaptured this section of road. They had taken their patients, their personnel, and most of their equipment, but they had not taken everything, and what they left behind was already telling Kessler things he was not sure he wanted to know. He stepped inside. The first thing he noticed was the floor, not the medical equipment, not the supplies, the floor. Someone had laid rubber matting across the entire stone surface of the farmhouse, not thrown it down, laid it in overlapping sections, edges taped, corners secured. The matting was clean, not spotless. There was blood near what had clearly been an operating table, but the blood was contained. The matting had been designed to be wiped, and whoever had used this room had wiped it. In a field hospital, in combat, on a floor that, 2 days ago, had been a Dutch farmer's kitchen, Kessler stood on that rubber matting for a long moment before he wrote anything in his notebook. He would spend for hours in that building. By the time he was done, his notebook had 37 pages of observations, measurements, and sketches. His report, forwarded to Army Group B headquarters and later captured by American forces during the Rhine crossing in March of 1945, would survive in the archives of the United States Army Center of Military History. Reading it today, what strikes you is not any single entry, it is the accumulation, page after page, of a precise, trained, unsentimental German engineer describing what an American field hospital contained. And underneath every clinical notation, a question he never quite asks directly, but that runs through every page like a current beneath ice. How did they do this? If the story of what American medicine built on the battlefields of the Second World War and what it revealed about the country that sent those doctors and nurses forward matters to you, hit subscribe and the like button. It helps this channel reach the people who care about this history. To understand what silenced Werner Kessler inside that farmhouse in Nijmegen, you first need to understand what a German field hospital looked like in September of 1944, not in 1939, not in the early years when Germany was winning and the supply chain function and the Reich's considerable medical establishment was still intact. In September of 1944, because that contrast, the gap between what Kessler knew and what he was looking at, is the story. A German infantry division in the autumn of 1944 was supported by a medical system that had been stretched, patched, depleted, and jury-rigged over 5 years of war on fronts that spanned from the Arctic Circle to the Sahara. The theoretical structure still existed on paper. Each division had a medical battalion with 2 collecting companies, a clearing company, and a field hospital section. It was a good system. It had been well designed. In 1939, it worked out by 1944. The collecting companies were short of personnel, The clearing companies were short of supplies. The field hospital sections were operating out of whatever buildings they could find with whatever equipment had not been consumed, destroyed, or diverted to higher priority units. Sulfonamide, the antibiotic that had become as essential to a field surgeon as a scalpel, was rationed. Plasma was scarce. Whole blood transfusions, which required type donors, refrigerated storage, and sterile collection equipment, were largely theoretical for a frontline German unit in France. Anesthesia supplies were inconsistent. Bandaging material was frequently substituted with paper gauze, a wartime economy measure that every German surgeon on the Western Front despised because paper gauze did not absorb the way cotton did not compress wounds the way cotton did, and disintegrated in contact with heavy bleeding in a way that cotton never would. Oberfeldarzt Friedrich Nagel, the senior medical officer of the 276th Infantry Division, wrote in his unit diary in August of 1944 a sentence that appears unremarkable until you read it in context. He wrote that his clearing company had performed 23 surgical procedures in the previous 48 hours using the last of their ether supply, and that future procedures would require alternative methods. Until resupply arrived, alternative methods, that was the language a German military doctor used in an official diary when he meant that his surgeons would be operating with inadequate anesthesia, not no anesthesia, alternative methods. The diary continued in the same tone, because that tone was the only professional option available. There was no point writing despair into an official record. There was only the next patient and whatever you had left to treat him with. Hold that phrase, alternative methods, because it will come back, and when it does, it will mean something very different. Standing next to what Kessler found in that farmhouse taught the German medical system of 1944 was not a failure of medicine. German doctors were among the best trained in the world. German surgical technique was sophisticated, innovative, and in several specific areas, genuinely ahead of anything the Allies were doing. German military surgeons had developed wound closure techniques and bone repair procedures under battlefield conditions that would influence post-war medicine for decades. The failure was not in the doctors, it was in the system behind the doctors. The supply chain that should have kept them stocked with anesthesia and plasma and sterile dressings and rubber floor matting. Had been eaten alive by 5 years of a war that consumed everything faster than Germany could produce it. This is what Kessler knew when he stepped into that farmhouse. This is the standard against which he was measuring everything he saw, and this is why the rubber matting stopped him at the door. The 44th Evacuation Hospital had been activated at Fort Jackson, South Carolina on the 15th of June, 1942. It was one of hundreds of medical units the United States Army built from almost nothing between 1941 and 1944, staffed by civilian doctors and nurses who had been practicing medicine in towns and cities across America and who received military commissions and approximately 6 months of training before being shipped overseas. The commanding officer in September of 1944 was Lieutenant Colonel Harold Weston, a 41-year-old surgeon from Cincinnati, Ohio, who had been a general practitioner before the war and had retrained as a field surgeon at the Army Medical Center in Washington. Weston was not an exceptional man in the way that generals are exceptional. He had not written papers, he had not pioneered techniques. He had been a good doctor in a mid-sized American city who saw patients, delivered babies, set broken bones, and went home for dinner. The Army had taken that man, given him a uniform and a rank and a set of equipment that no German field surgeon in September of 1944 could have assembled if his life depended on it, and sent him to the Netherlands. The equipment is what mattered, not Weston. The equipment. When Kessler moved through the farmhouse with his notebook, the first thing he catalogued after the floor batting was the lighting to portable generator sets, both American manufactured, both diesel, both still partially fueled, had been left behind in the hasty evacuation. They were connected by heavy rubber-sheathed cable to a network of ceiling-mounted fixtures throughout the operating area. The fixtures themselves were nothing remarkable, simple metal housings with standard bulbs, but the cable routing was precise, the connections were weatherproofed, and the generator sets were mounted on rubber isolation pads to reduce vibration. Transmissioned to the floor. Kessler, the structural engineer from Stuttgart, who had once designed a hospital annex in the Black Forest, sketched the cable routing in his notebook with the careful hand of a man who could not quite believe what he was looking at. A German forward surgical unit operating in a requisitioned building ran sliding from whatever electrical supply the building offered or from a single generator, whose cable was run in the most direct path possible, functional, adequate, and nothing more. What he was looking at was not adequate, it was considered. Someone had thought about the vibration from the generators reaching the operating table through the floor and had put rub or pads under the mounts. Someone in a war zone, setting up a temporary hospital in a Dutch farmhouse, had thought about generator vibration. He wrote 3 question marks in his notebook next to the sketch of the isolation pads. Then he found the blood bank. In the corner of the largest canvas structure erected beside the farmhouse, the Americans had left behind a portable refrigeration unit. It was a mechanical refrigerator, not large, roughly the size of a domestic icebox, powered by its own small electric motor connected to the generator network. Inside were 4 glass bottles, each holding approximately 500 milliliters of whole blood. Each bottle was labeled with a blood type, a collection date, and a donor identification number. The collection dates were 3 days old. The bottles had been left behind because the power to the refrigeration unit had failed when the generators were shut down during the evacuation, and by the time anyone noticed, the blood was no longer certifiably viable for transfusion. 4 bottles of whole blood, abandoned in a field because they were too old. Kessler stared at those 4 bottles for a long time before he wrote anything. He was not a doctor. He did not know in precise clinical terms what whole blood meant in a forward surgical unit. What he knew, what every German officer on the Western Front knew by September of 1944, was that blood transfusions at the front were something that happened in theory and not in practice. The logistical chain required for whole blood, typed donors, sterile collection, refrigerated transport, reliable power for storage, was not something a German divisional medical unit could sustain. Dried plasma, a dehydrated substitute that could be reconstituted with sterile water and did not require refrigeration or blood typing, was the German army's compromise. Plasma kept men alive when blood loss threatened them. It was not blood, it was a substitute for blood, and every German surgeon who used it knew the difference because the patients who received plasma survived at lower rates than those who received whole blood. Particularly in cases of massive hemorrhage, the Americans were doing whole blood transfusion at a forward evacuation hospital 2 miles from the front line and had left 4 bottles behind because they were 3 days old. Kessler wrote 1 sentence under his sketch of the refrigeration unit. He wrote it in the formal German of an engineer's report, and it translates roughly as follows: the provision of refrigerated whole blood storage at this level of the medical chain indicates a logistics capability without parallel in current German practice. Without parallel, those 2 words, written by a German engineering officer in a Dutch farmhouse in September of 1944, are the beginning of the answer to the question in the title of this story. But they are only the beginning, because Kessler had not yet found the supply room. The supply room was a side chamber off the main canvas structure, roughly 4 meters by 3 meters, with a plywood floor laid over the grass and a series of metal shelving units bolted to a central frame that could be collapsed and loaded onto a single truck in under 30 minutes. Kessler measured the shelving. He photographed it with a German military camera that had been issued to his unit for exactly this kind of documentation, and then he began cataloging what was on the shelves, what the Americans had left behind in their hurry. The list in his notebook runs to 6 pages, not because there was so much left, The Americans had taken most of their supplies when they evacuated. What remained was the overflow, the backup stock, a reserve that had not been loaded because the trucks were already full. And that overflow, that backup stock, that reserve, was more than Nagel's entire 276th Infantry Division Clearing Company had received in the previous 2 months. Sulfonamide powder. 32 packets, each packet containing 5 grams, each one identical to the others, each one stamped with a lot number, a production date, and a storage instruction. Not loose powder in a jar, not tablets rationed from a central supply, individual packets, sealed, sterile, ready to be torn open and poured into a wound by any medic, any soldier, any person who could read the simple instruction printed on the outside. Morphine syringes, 41 units. A syringe was a small collapsible metal tube with an attached needle, pre-filled with a precise dose of morphine, sealed, sterile, ready for immediate injection. A soldier who reached a wounded man could administer morphine in seconds. No vial, no separate syringe, no calculation of dosage. The dose was already measured. The needle was already attached. You uncapped it, you injected it, and the man's pain diminished in minutes. Plasma units, 23, each one a sealed glass bottle of dried plasma with a separate bottle of sterile water and a mixing set, complete, self-contained, requiring no refrigeration, usable by a medic with basic training, 23 of them in the backup stock of a single evacuation hospital. Backup stock, whole blood administration sets, 8, each one a complete kit for transfusion, tubing, needles, flow regulator, all sterile, all individually packaged, all identical. Penicillin ampoules, 60, penicillin, a drug that had entered mass production in the United States less than 2 years earlier, that German military medicine was still attempting to synthesize in adequate quantities, that German field surgeons on the Western Front requested and rarely received. 60 ampoules in the backup stock of a forward evacuation hospital that had been in the Netherlands for less than a week. Kessler listed every item. His notebook entries become progressively shorter as the list goes on, as if the act of writing each item down required less effort because the pattern was already established and the pattern was simple. Why this? Everything the German medical system had run out of, rationed, substituted, or done without, the Americans had in quantity, standardized, labeled, sealed, and ready. He reached the end of the shelving and stood in the middle of the plywood floor for a moment. Then he wrote something in his notebook that was not a measurement, not a catalog entry, not a technical observation. It was a single sentence, written in a slightly different hand, slightly more compressed, as if written quickly before the thought escaped. He wrote, in translation, "This is not a field hospital. This is a factory for keeping men alive." To understand why those words, a factory for keeping men alive, landed with such weight in Kessler's notebook, you need to understand what was happening to wounded men on both sides of that road in the Netherlands in September of 1944, not in the aggregate, not as a statistic, but in the specific, physical, minute-by-minute reality of what it meant to be wounded in a modern battle and what happened to you in the next hour depending on which army you belonged to, because the gap between those two realities was not a gap in courage or in medical knowledge. It was a gap in systems, and systems, as Werner Kessler was beginning to understand standing in that plywood-floored supply room, were the thing that separated a factory for keeping men alive from a building where men died, waiting for supplies that never came. On the morning of September 17, 1944, 2 days before Kessler entered that farmhouse, the largest airborne operation in history had begun, Operation Market Garden. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's attempt to seize a series of bridges across the Dutch river system and drive a corridor into Germany before winter closed the campaign season. Nearly 35,000 paratroopers dropped from the sky into the Netherlands in a single day, American units of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions secured bridges at Eindhoven and Nijmegen. British paratroopers of the 1st Airborne Division landed at Arnhem, the furthest objective, the bridge too far, that would become the most famous failure of the campaign. Along the corridor below Arnhem, American ground forces of the 30th Corps pushed north on a single elevated row that the paratroopers had nicknamed Hell's Highway. The Germans counterattacked repeatedly, cutting the road, isolating units, and creating the kind of chaotic, shifting, close-quarters combat that produced casualties faster than any medical plan could anticipate. Private First Class James Alderton, 21 years old, from Macon, Georgia, serving with the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division, was hit by mortar shrapnel at approximately 0840 on the morning of September 18th, to fragments, one entering his left shoulder and one tearing through the outer muscle of his right thigh. He did not lose consciousness. He crawled behind a low stone wall and pressed his hand against the thigh wound, which was bleeding heavily. His battalion aide man, a 19-year-old from Cleveland named Thomas Reedy, reached him in under 4 minutes. Reedy had been trained for 11 weeks at Camp Pickett, Virginia, specifically in forward casualty care. He was not a doctor, he was not a nurse, he was a private first class with a medical bag and a set of procedures that had been drilled into him until they were reflexive. Reedy's first action was the wound in the thigh. He tore open a sulfonamide packet, the same individual sealed packets that Kessler would find on those shelves 2 days later, and poured the powder directly into the wound. Then he applied a field dressing, a compressed bandage with attached ties, and secured it with enough pressure to slow the bleeding without cutting circulation. Then he reached into his bag and produced a morphine syringe. He uncapped the needle, injected it into Alderton's arm, and noted the time and the dose with a grease pencil on a small tag that he attached to Alderton's collar. The tag would travel with Alderton through every subsequent level of care, telling each new set of hands exactly what he had received, and when, from Reedy, Alderton went to the battalion aid station, a requisitioned Dutch house 400 yards behind the line, where a medical officer cleaned and redressed both wounds, started a plasma infusion for the blood loss, and made the decision that the thigh wound required surgical exploration. He was loaded into a Jeep ambulance, a standard quartermaster Jeep fitted with brackets to carry to litter patients, and driven to the 44th Evacuation Hospital. Total time from wounding to surgical facility, 2 hours and 20 minutes. He was on an operating table within 40 minutes of arriving. The surgeon who operated on him was a 33-year-old from Baltimore who had been a general surgeon in civilian life and who had performed more than 200 battlefield procedures. Since arriving in France in July, he removed both fragments, repaired the muscle damage in the thigh, debrided the shoulder wound, administered penicillin, and closed both incisions with the kind of confident, unhurried precision that comes from a man who has everything he needs within arm's reach. Alderton was evacuated to a general hospital in Belgium the following morning. He returned to his unit 6 weeks later. He lived until 1987. Now, hold that timeline, 2 hours and 20 minutes from a muddy field in the Netherlands to a surgical table. Hold it against what was happening on the other side of the line. Gefreiter Hans Brouwer, 22 years old, from Kaiserslautern, serving with the 9th SS Panzer Division, Ohnstoffen, was hit by rifle fire at approximately the same time as Alderton, roughly 3 kilometers to the north, near the town of Els. 1 bullet through the lower left abdomen, a wound that every military surgeon on every side of every war knew was among the most dangerous in combat. Abdominal wounds required surgery within hours to have a survivable outcome. Every hour of delay increased the risk of peritonitis, the infection of the abdominal cavity that killed men not quickly but slowly, in a process of mounting fever and spreading pain that military doctors of the era described in their reports with a clinical detachment that barely contained the horror of what they were describing. Brouwer was reached by his company medic in approximately 15 minutes. The medic applied a field dressing and gave him a morphine tablet, an oral tablet, not an injectable syringe, because injectable morphine had been unavailable at company level in the Hohenstaufen division for 3 weeks. The tablet would take longer to work and would be partially neutralized by the shock response that was already constricting Brouwer's peripheral circulation. The battalion aid station was 2 kilometers back on a row that had been under intermittent artillery fire since dawn. The stretcher bearers who carried Brouwer covered that distance in 40 minutes at the aid station. The medical officer looked at the abdominal wound and did what every German battalion surgeon in the Netherlands was doing in September of 1944 when he saw a wound that required immediate surgical intervention. He wrote a priority evacuation tag, administered what plasma he had left, and waited for transport. The transport was a horse-drawn wagon. The divisional clearing station, the next level of care, was 11 kilometers to the east. The road was cratered and partially blocked by a destroyed half-track that had not yet been cleared. The wagon reached the clearing station in 3 hours and 20 minutes. At the clearing station, there was no surgeon available. The division's 2 forward surgeons were both operating on cases that had arrived earlier. The medical officer at the clearing station stabilized Brouwer as best he could, administered the last of his sulfonamide tablets, and noted in the evacuation record that surgical intervention was urgently required. Brouwer waited for more hours before a surgeon was freed up. By the time the surgery began, 11 hours had passed since the wounding. The surgeon who operated was competent, trained, and working with instruments that were adequate and anesthetic supplies that were not. He used a combination of ether and local infiltration because his ether supply was limited and he was rationing it across 3 pending cases. He repaired the bowel damage he could reach, closed the abdomen, and wrote in his notes that the prognosis was uncertain given the delay and the early signs of peritoneal contamination he had observed during the procedure. Brouwer developed peritonitis 4 days later. He died on September 26, 1944. He was 22 years old. 2 men, hit on the same morning, 2 kilometers apart, by weapons that produced wounds of roughly comparable severity. One was eating breakfast in a Belgian hospital 6 weeks later. One was dead in 9 days. The difference was not the wound. The difference was not the doctors. The difference was the system between the wound and the doctor, and that system, its presence on one side and its absence on the other, is what Werner Kessler was standing inside when he wrote those words in his notebook, a factory for keeping men alive. The factory had a blueprint. It had not been improvised in the field. It had not grown organically from the experience of the campaign. It had been designed, argued over, tested, revised, and then built at a scale that no other military in history had attempted before a single American soldier set foot in Europe. The man most responsible for that blueprint was not a general. He was not a politician. He was a 50-year-old surgeon from Boston named Major General Norman T. Kirk, who had been appointed Surgeon General of the United States Army in June of 1943 and who had spent the 14 months between his appointment and the Normandy invasion doing something that military surgeons before him had never been given the time or the authority to do. He had studied every mistake. Kirk had access to the medical records of the North African campaign, the Sicily campaign, the Italian campaign, and the detailed after-action medical reports from British and Commonwealth forces going back to 1940. He had access to the German medical literature captured in North Africa. He had access to the Soviet medical reports that came through the intelligence channels, and he had the authority, which no previous Army Surgeon General had fully possessed, to translate what he learned directly into doctrine, procurement, training, and logistics before the largest operation in American military history began. What Kirk found when he read those records was a pattern so consistent across every campaign, every army, every theater, that it had the character of a law of physics, rather than a military observation. The pattern was this: the time between wounding and surgery was the single most reliable predictor of survival, more reliable than the nature of the wound, more reliable than the skill of the surgeon, more reliable than the quality of the postoperative care. The clock started the moment a man was hit, and every minute on that clock was a minute working against him. The British had understood this and had built a casualty evacuation system around it that was better than anything that had existed. In the First World War, the Germans had understood it and had built an even more sophisticated system, one that had worked brilliantly in 1939 and 1940 and had been slowly strangled by the logistics of a war that expanded faster than Germany's industrial capacity could support it. What Kirk understood, and what separated his approach from every previous military medical planner, was that understanding the principle was not enough. The principle had been understood since the Napoleonic Wars. The French surgeon Dominique Jean Larrey had grasped it when he designed the first ambulance system in 1792. What had always broken the principle in practice was not ignorance. It was supply. It was standardization. It was the gap between what a doctor needed at the forward edge and what the supply chain could reliably deliver to him in the middle of a battle. Kirk's solution was not a medical innovation. It was an industrial one. He did not design a better surgical technique. He designed a system in which every item a forward surgeon needed was available, standardized, interchangeable, and present at every level of the evacuation chain simultaneously, not waiting to be resupplied, not rationed from a central depot, not substituted with an alternative when the real thing ran out, present, always, in the right quantity, in the right packaging, ready to use without preparation. The sulfonamide packets that Kessler found on those shelves were not a medical decision, they were an industrial decision. The choice to package 5 grams of sulfonamide powder in an individual sealed packet with a printed instruction, rather than in a jar that a medic would measure from, was a decision made by a logistics officer who understood that in combat, a medic under fire does not measure, he tears, he pours, he moves. The packaging removed the measurement. The packaging made the correct dose automatic. The morphine syringe was not a medical decision, it was an engineering decision. The choice to pre-fill a collapsible tube with a precisely calibrated dose and attach a needle that required no assembly was a decision made by a man who understood that in a forward aid station, the difference between a medication that could be administered in 10 seconds and one that required 30 seconds of preparation was not trivial. It was the difference between treating 4 men in a minute and treating 2, the plasma unit. The sealed bottle of dried plasma with the integrated mixing set was not a medical decision, it was a manufacturing decision. The choice to include everything required for reconstitution and administration in a single sealed package that require no refrigeration, no specialized training, and no additional equipment was a decision that had been made in a factory in New Jersey by engineers who had been asked a specific question. If a 19-year-old with 11 weeks of training needs to save a man's life in a bombed-out house in France, what does he need, and how do we package it so that he cannot fail? That question, asked and answered in New Jersey in 1943, was what Kessler was holding in his hands in a Dutch farmhouse in 1944. The penicillin was the detail that told the deepest story. And to understand why, you need to understand what penicillin was in September of 1944 and what it had been 3 years earlier. Alexander Fleming had discovered penicillin in 1928. Howard Florey and Ernst Chain had demonstrated its therapeutic potential in 1940. By 1941, it was clear to every microbiologist who had seen the results that penicillin was not merely a better antibiotic than sulfonamide. It was a different order of medicine entirely. Where sulfonamide inhibited bacterial growth and gave the body's immune system a fighting chance, penicillin killed bacteria directly, rapidly, and with a specificity that left healthy tissue intact. wound infections that sulfonamide slowed. Penicillin stopped gas gangrene, the bacterial infection that had killed more soldiers in the First World War than artillery, was penicillin's particular victim. A wound treated with penicillin within hours of contamination had a survival rate that would have seemed miraculous to any surgeon who had practiced before 1943. The problem was production. Fleming's original mold produced penicillin in quantities, measured in micrograms. To treat a single patient required hundreds of thousands of units. In 1941, the entire world supply of penicillin could treat perhaps a dozen patients. What happened next is one of the most consequential industrial decisions in the history of medicine, and it was made not by a pharmaceutical company, not by a university, not by a government ministry, but by a committee of American engineers and chemists who were given a single directive by the War PR Production Board in 1943 and told to solve it by any means necessary. The directive was simple: produce enough penicillin to treat every wounded American soldier in the European theater. By June of 1944, the date was 11 months away. The engineers looked at the existing production methods, which involved growing penicillin mold on the surface of liquid in shallow trays, and concluded immediately that surface fermentation could never scale to the required volume. They needed a different approach. They found it in a method called deep fermentation, growing the mold in large stir tanks, submerged in broth, with forced aeration. The technique had never been used for penicillin. It required new strains of mold that could survive submerged conditions. It required new tank designs. It required new extraction and purification processes. It required, in short, the complete reinvention of penicillin production from first principles in less than a year. 20-1 American pharmaceutical companies were brought into the program: Pfizer, Merck, Squibb, Abbott, Lilly, each one assigned specific aspects of the production challenge. Engineers from industries that had never touched pharmaceuticals, men who designed brewery equipment and chemical processing plant and dairy pasteurization systems, were brought in to solve the engineering problems that the chemists could not solve alone. By May of 1943, monthly production had reached 400 million units. By the end of 1943, it had reached 20 billion units. By June of 1944, American factories were producing 100 billion units of penicillin per month, enough to treat every wounded soldier, every infected casualty, every case of gas gangrene and sepsis and wound infection in the entire European theater, with enough remaining to begin supplying the civilian population of liberated Europe. The cost per dose had dropped from thousands of dollars in 1940 to a few cents. By 1944, that trajectory, from laboratory curiosity to mass-produced weapon in 24 months, was not a medical achievement. It was an American industrial achievement. It was the same achievement that had produced 49,000 Sherman tanks and 640,000 Jeeps and 2 million Garand rifles. The application was different. The principle was identical. Find out what the soldier needs. Build the system that delivers it. Build it at a scale that makes scarcity impossible. The 60 penicillin ampoules on those shelves in Nijmegen were the end product of that system. Kessler cataloged them with the same notation he had used for everything else: quantity, packaging, labeling, storage condition. But he paused at penicillin longer than he had paused at anything else in the supply room, because penicillin was the item that made the picture complete. Sulfonamide he could explain as a logistics achievement. Plasma he could explain as an engineering achievement. Morphine syrettes he could explain as a manufacturing achievement. But penicillin in a forward evacuation hospital, 60 ampoules in the backup stock, the overflow, the things that had not fit on the trucks, in a unit that had been in the Netherlands for less than a week, that was not an achievement. That was a statement about what America had decided its soldiers were worth. He wrote nothing in his notebook next to the penicillin entry, just the quantity, just the number, 60. Sometimes a number, is enough. There was one more room Kessler had not yet entered, the operating theater itself. He had saved it for last, the way a man saves the most difficult conversation for the end of a long day. When the smaller things have been dealt with and there is nothing left but the thing that matters most, the operating theater was in the largest canvas structure, a 30 by 16-foot surgical tent erected against the side of the farmhouse so that its rear wall shared the farmhouse's stone construction, which provided both structural stability and some insulation from the autumn cold. The tent itself was a standard United States Army surgical tent, model M1942, which had been designed by the Army Quartermaster Corps in collaboration with the Army Medical Department specifically for forward surgical use. Kessler did not know this history. He knew only what he saw. He saw a floor, not the rubber matting of the farmhouse, a different surface here. A wooden decking of interlocking panels that could be assembled by two men in under 30 minutes and that elevated the working surface above ground moisture and provided a stable, cleanable platform that would not turn to mud if the tent was erected in wet conditions. The decking was stained but scrubbed. Someone had cleaned it before the evacuation. He saw lighting, for overhead surgical lamps mounted on adjustable arms extending from a central ceiling track. Battery-powered backup units clipped to the 10 poles at each corner, fully charged, ready to activate automatically if the generator power failed. In a surgical setting, losing power during an operation was not an inconvenience, it was a potential death sentence. The Americans had thought about it. They had built the redundancy. And he saw the operating table, not a table, two operating tables, side by side, identical, each one a collapsible metal frame with a padded surface that could be adjusted for height, angle, and position. Each table had its own integrated drainage system, a slight slope to the surface and a collection channel at the lower edge, designed so that the blood and fluid from a surgical procedure drained away from the surgeon's working area rather than pooling beneath his hands. Kessler measured the tables. He sketched the drainage channel in his notebook. He was an engineer, not a doctor, and the drainage channel was the kind of detail that caught his specific attention. Not because it was complex. It was not complex. It was a simple gravity drain, nothing more. But it was there. It had been designed in. Someone had thought about blood pooling under a surgeon's hands during an operation and had solved the problem before any surgeon had to improvise a solution in the field. Next to each table, a wheeled instrument stand, empty now, the instruments long evacuated, but the stand itself remaining, stainless steel, with a lower shelf for larger items and a raised upper surface at the precise height that a surgeon standing at the table would require. The height was not approximate, it was calibrated. Kessler measured it against the table height and noted in his notebook that the relationship between the two surfaces was clearly intentional. Against the far wall, a sterilization unit, a portable autoclave, electric-powered, connected to the generator network, capable of sterilizing a complete set of surgical instruments in approximately 25 minutes. The autoclave had been evacuated with the unit. What remained were the connection points, the electrical outlets, the water supply fitting, and a shelf at the correct height for loading and unloading the unit. The absence of the machine made its presence more visible, the way a painting removed from a wall leaves a clean rectangle on the faded wallpaper. Kessler stood in the center of the operating theater for a long time. He had been in the building for nearly 3 hours. His notebook was almost full. He had not eaten since early morning and he was cold because the generators were off and the tent had lost whatever war empathy they had provided. He was tired in the way that a man gets tired, not from physical exertion, but from the sustained effort of processing something that does not fit into his existing understanding of the world. He looked at the two operating tables with their drainage channels. He looked at the backup lighting units on the tent poles. He looked at the generator connection points where the autoclave had been. He looked at the scrubbed wooden decking on the floor. And then he wrote the last entry in his notebook for that day. It was longer than the others. It was not a measurement or catalog entry or technical observation. It was, for a German engineering officer in an official report, something remarkably close to a confession. He wrote, in translation, the facility represents a standard of preparation and material provision that has no equivalent in my experience of German forward medical units at any point in the current war. The items present are not remarkable individually. The rubber floor covering, the generator isolation, the refrigerated blood storage, the standardized pharmaceutical packaging, none of these elements is beyond German engineering capability. What is remarkable is their simultaneous presence at this level of the medical chain. Each item presupposes the existence of all the others. The blood storage requires the generator requires the isolation mounts. The lighting requires the backup units. The surgical tables require the drainage. The drainage requires the stable floor. Remove any element, and the system degrades. The system has been designed as a system, not as a collection of individual items, but as an integrated whole, in which every component serves and depends on every other component. This is not how we build field hospitals. This is how we build factories. He paused at that word. Then he added one more line. The question I cannot answer from observation alone is not how they built this. The question is how many of these they built. If this is one unit among dozens, the implications are significant. If it is one unit among hundreds, the implications are something else entirely. He closed his notebook. He did not know the answer to his question yet, but the answer was out there, in the records of the Army Medical Department, in the production figures of the pharmaceutical companies, in the training rosters of the Army Medical Center in Washington, and the answer was not dozens. It was not hundreds. By June of 1944, the United States Army had activated and deployed 73 evacuation hospitals to the European theater alone, each one staffed by trained surgeons, nurses, and medical technicians, each one equipped with the same standardized kit, the same rubber matting, the same generator sets on isolation mounts, the same backup lighting, the same refrigeration for whole blood, the same sulfonamide packets, the same morphine syringes, the same penicillin, the same operating tables with the same drainage channels and the same instrument stands calibrated to the same height. 73 evacuation hospitals, identical in equipment, interchangeable in capability, spread across France and Belgium and the Netherlands and southern England, each one a factory for keeping men alive, each one built to the same blueprint, each one stocked from the same supply chain, each one capable of being packed, moved, and operational again within 24 hours, and behind them, the clearing stations, and behind the clearing stations, the field hospitals, and behind the field hospitals, the general hospitals in England, and behind the general hospitals, the hospital ships, and behind the hospital ships, the general hospitals in the United States, a chain of care 4,000 miles long, standardized at every link, supplied at every level, designed not by doctors alone, but by engineers and logisticians and factory managers and packaging designers who had been asked a single question and had answered it with the full industrial weight of a country that knew how to build things at scale. What does a wounded soldier need, and how do we make sure he has it? Kessler packed his notebook and his camera and walked out of the farmhouse into the gray September afternoon. He had 37 pages of notes and photographs. He had his report to write. He had answers to some of his questions and new questions that the answers had produced. He did not yet know that the report he was about to write would be captured by American intelligence 6 months later. He did not know that it would be archived in Washington. He did not know that it would still be there 80 years later. His careful engineer's handwriting. His 3 question marks next to the sketch of the generator isolation mounts. His measured observation about the drainage channels on the operating tables. His final entry about factories. He knew only what he had seen, and what he had seen was enough. The report that Werner Kessler wrote that evening, in a billet 6 kilometers east of Nijmegen, took him for hours. He worked by candlelight because the building had no generator and the autumn darkness came early. In the Netherlands in September, he wrote in the precise, formal German of an engineer's technical assessment, with numbered sections, subheadings, and marginal references to his notebook sketches. He did not editorialize. He did not draw conclusions that his observations did not directly support. He was an engineer. He reported what he had measured and what he had seen. But engineering reports have a language of their own, and in that language, certain phrases carry more weight than their literal meaning. When Kessler wrote that the facility represented a standard of preparation and material provision without parallel in current German practice, he was not writing a compliment. He was writing a diagnosis, and the diagnosis was not about the Americans. It was about Germany. He submitted the report through his divisional chain of command. It was forwarded to Army Group B headquarters. It was read, stamped, filed, and eventually buried in the administrative avalanche of a headquarters fighting a losing war on three fronts simultaneously. There is no record of any response to Kessler's report. No reply from Army Group B, no acknowledgement from OKW, the Wehrmacht High Command. No indication that anyone in a position of authority read what he had written and acted on it. This was not unusual. By September of 1944, the German military command structure was receiving hundreds of reports like Kessler's every week. Reports about American logistics, American supply depots, American equipment, American medical facilities, American artillery, American vehicle parks, reports that all said, in their different technical languages, the same thing: the Americans have more, the Americans have better, the Americans have it organized in ways we cannot replicate. The reports were accurate, the reports were filed, the war continued. And this is where the story shifts, because what happened to Kessler's report is not the most important part of what he found in that farmhouse. The most important part is what happened to the men on both sides of that road. What happened to James Alderton and Hans Brauer and the thousands of men like them whose survival or death was determined not by the quality of the doctors who treated them, but by the system that delivered those doctors and everything those doctors needed to the right place at the right time. The numbers tell that story with a clarity that no single report could match. In the European theater of operations, from the Normandy landings in June of 1944 to the German surrender in May of 1945, the United States Army treated approximately 750,000 battle casualties. Of those 750,000 men who were wounded badly enough to require medical treatment beyond basic first aid, roughly 97% survived. 97%. That number requires a moment of stillness before you continue reading, because it is not the number you would expect from a war of this scale and intensity. It is not the number that any previous war had produced. In the First World War, the survival rate for comparably wounded American soldiers had been approximately 92%, and that figure was considered a triumph of modern medicine at the time. A vast improvement over the wars of the previous century. In the Civil War, a wound that reached a surgeon had roughly a 50% chance of killing you. In the Napoleonic Wars, the odds were worse. From 1864 to 1944, in 80 years of medical progress, the survival rate for wounded soldiers had climbed from roughly 50% to 92%. In the specific conditions of the European theater in 1944 and 1945, the American system pushed it to 97%. 5 percentage points sounds modest. It is not modest, applied across 750,000 casualties. 5 percentage points is 37,500 men. 37,500 men who would have died under the medical system of the previous war who came home under this one. 37,500 men who went back to Georgia and Ohio and California and New York, who married the women who had been writing them letters, who watched their children grow up, who became grandfathers. The system that Werner Kessler stood inside on the morning of September 19, 1944, saved 37,500 lives beyond what the best previous system had achieved, and the German system, the one that had been stretched and rationed and depleted until Friedrich Nagel was writing about alternative methods in his unique diary, produced numbers that the German military medical service never fully tabulated because by 1945, the record keeping had broken down along with everything else. The estimates compiled by post-war researchers suggest a German battlefield survival rate in the Western Theater in 1944 of somewhere between 80 and 85% for men who reached a surgeon, lower than the American rate by 12 to 17 percentage points. Applied across the German casualties of the same period. That gap represents tens of thousands of men. Tens of thousands of men who died not from wounds that were unsurvivable, but from wounds that became unsurvivable because the system behind them had run out of what it needed to keep them alive. This is what Werner Kessler was measuring with his engineer's notebook in that farmhouse. Not rubber matting, not generator isolation mounts, not drainage channels on operating tables. He was measuring the distance between a 97% survival rate and an 85% survival rate. He was measuring it in plywood floors and sealed sulfonamide packets and 60 ampoules of penicillin in the backup stock of a uni that had been in the Netherlands for less than a week. He did not know those numbers. He could not have known them in September of 1944, but he felt them, in the way that a good engineer feels a structural problem before he has run the calculations. Something in the proportions was wrong. Something in the load distribution was off. The building was going to stand for a while yet, but it was not going to stand forever. There is a detail in Kessler's report that comes near the end, almost as an afterthought, that historians who have read the document tend to pass over because it seems minor compared to the medical supplies and the operating tables. It is not minor. It is, in its quiet way, the most devastating observation in the entire 37 pages. Kessler noticed the trash, not in a derogatory sense. He noticed it as an engineer notices a detail that does not fit his existing model. In the corner of the canvas structure nearest the entrance, there was a collection of discarded materials from the hospital's recent operation. Packaging, the wrappers, the torn envelopes, the empty boxes, the used and discarded outer casings of the supplies that had been consumed in the previous 48 hours of the hospital's operation. He catalogued it. Empty sulfonamide packets, used, torn open, powder consumed, empty morphine syringe casings, the collapsible metal tubes after the medication had been administered, empty plasma mixing sets, used blood administration tubing, discarded penicillin, ampoule packaging, torn surgical glove wrappers, empty suture packets, used instrument sterilization pouches, each item individual, each item single-use, each item designed to be used once and discarded. Kessler had grown up in a country where medical supplies were used, resterilized, used again, resterilized again, until they could no longer be resterilized without risk of degradation or contamination. German surgical gloves were washed and ray powder after each use. German suture materials were supplied in bulk and cut to length as needed. German instrument pouches were cloth, washable, reused dozens of times. This was not poverty, this was the German medical tradition, careful, conservative, nothing wasted, everything preserved for reuse. What Kessler was looking at in that corner was the physical evidence of a completely different philosophy, a philosophy that said, the risk of contamination from reuse is greater than the cost of replacement. Therefore, use once and discard. Therefore, build a supply chain that can deliver fresh, sterile, single-use items faster than they are consumed. Therefore, design every item for single use from the beginning, so that no one in a forward surgical unit ever has to make the decision between the risk of reuse and the unavailability of replacement. He wrote about the trash for 2 pages. It was the longest single entry in the report, because the trash was not waste, The trash was the proof that the supply chain worked. You could only afford to discard single-use items if you were certain that more were coming. The pile of used packaging in the corner of that tent was a monument to certainty, to the unquestioned assumption, built into every procedure, every package, every item design, that resupply was not a possibility, but a guarantee. German medical units in France and the Netherlands in September of 1944 were not re-sterilizing their gloves and reusing their suture pouches because they were careful. They were doing it because they were not certain more were coming, and that uncertainty, that corrosive absence of confidence in the supply chain, was itself a medical problem. Because a surgeon who is rationing his supplies operates differently from a surgeon who is not. A surgeon who is uncertain whether he will have penicillin tomorrow uses less penicillin today. A surgeon who is uncertain whether he will have enough suture material uses smaller stitches. A surgeon who is uncertain about his anesthesia supply moves faster, takes less time, makes decisions he would not make if the resources were guaranteed. The uncertainty itself killed people, not dramatically, not in ways that showed up clearly in any single case record, but statistically, across thousands of cases. The accumulated effect of 1,000 small decisions made under the shadow of scarcity produced outcomes that were measurably worse than outcomes produced by a system in which scarcity was not a factor. Norman Kirk had understood this. It was perhaps the deepest insight behind the system he built. He had understood that the goal was not merely to provide supplies. It was to provide supplies in such quantity and with such reliability that the possibility of shortage never entered a surgeon's mind, that the surgeon's only job was the surgery, that every other consideration, the supply, the power, the lighting, the sterilization, the anesthesia, the blood, had been solved before he arrived, and would be solved again before he needed it next. A surgeon who does not think about supplies is a better surgeon than one who does. That was the equation, and building the system that produced that surgeon was not a medical achievement. It was the achievement of a country that had decided, at the level of industrial policy and national priority, that its soldiers were worth that investment. Werner Kessler survived the war. He was captured by British forces near Bremen in April of 1945 and held as a prisoner of war until October of that year. He returned to Stuttgart and rebuilt his engineering practice. He designed several notable commercial buildings in the post-war Reconstruction period and taught structural engineering at the Stuttgart Technical University until his retirement in 1971. His military record, including the report he wrote in Nijmegen, was captured by American forces during the Rhine crossing and archived at the Washington National Records Center in Suitland, Maryland, where it was declassified in 1965. It was reviewed by a handful of military historians in the 1970s and cited in a footnote in a 1979 study of German Army Group B operations during Market Garden. The footnote noted the report's observations about American medical logistics and described them as of historical interest. The study did not quote Kessler's final entry about factories. There is no record that Kessler knew his report had been captured. There is no record that he ever tried to find out what had happened to it. After the war, he did not write memoirs. He did not give interviews about his military service. He designed buildings and taught students and lived quietly in Stuttgart until his death in 1983. He was 73 years old. James Alderton, the 21-year-old paratrooper from Macon, Georgia, who received sulfonamide and a morphine syringe and a plasma infusion and a jeep ambulance, and a surgeon within 2 hours and 20 minutes of being hit by mortar fragments near Nijmegen, was discharged from the army in November of 1945. He went back to Macon and worked for 31 years as a mechanic at a Ford dealership. He married a woman named Ruth in 1947. They had 4 children. He died in 1987 at the age of 64, of a heart condition unrelated to his wartime wounds. He never knew that a German engineering officer had stood in the hospital that saved his life 2 days after he left it cataloging the rubber matting and the generator isolation mounts and the 60 ampoules of penicillin in the backup stock, and writing 37 pages of notes about the system that had kept him alive. Norman Kirk, the Surgeon General who designed that system, served until 1947 and retired as a full general, the first Army Medical Corps officer to hold that rank. He returned to private practice in Washington, D.C., and continued operating until his late 60s. He received the Distinguished Service Medal, the Legion of Merit, and a number of honorary degrees. He died in 1960. His obituaries mentioned his wartime service. None of them mentioned the survival rate. None of them put the number 37,500 next to his name, though that number, or something close to it, is what his work produced. History tends to remember the generals who moved divisions. It is slower to remember the men who built the systems that kept those divisions alive. Edwin Howard Armstrong, whose FM radio technology built the first wall against German signals intelligence, who gave his patents to the American military for free, who died stepping from a window in 1954, never knew that his invention had also powered the generators in every American forward surgical hospital. In Europe, the generator sets that Kessler cataloged in Nijmegen, the ones on the rubber isolation mounts, the ones that powered the surgical lighting and the refrigerated blood storage and the autoclave, ran on the same electrical principles that Armstrong had spent his life developing. The connection is indirect. The relationship is real. The man who gave America a voice the enemy could not hear also gave America the power to keep its wounded men alive in the dark. He died not knowing either thing. Friedrich Nagel, the German divisional medical officer who had written about alternative methods in his unique diary, was captured in the rear pocket in April of 1945. He was held for 8 months and released in December. He returned to medicine in post-war West Germany and practiced as a general physician in Freiburg until the 1970s. In 1962, he was interviewed by a researcher from the German Military History Research Office who was compiling oral histories of Wehrmacht medical officers. The interview ran to several hours. Nagel spoke at length about the logistical failures of the German medical supply system in 1944, about the rationing of sulfonamide, about the absence of penicillin at forward unit level, about the alternative methods entry in his unit diary and what it had meant in practice. Near the end of the interview, the researcher asked him whether he had ever examined captured American medical facilities or equipment. Nagel said that he had not, personally, but he said that he had spoken to colleagues who had. He said that what those colleagues described had affected them in ways that combat had not. He said they had used a word he had not heard German officers use often in his experience. He said they had described what they found as shameful. Not that the Americans had better supplies, not that the Americans had a more efficient system, shameful, as if the existence of what the Americans had built reflected something about what Germany had chosen not to build, as if the 60 ampoules of penicillin in the backup stock of a forward evacuation hospital were not just a medical resource, but a moral statement, a statement about what a country believed its soldiers were worth. Germany had believed its soldiers were worth courage, worth discipline, worth the willingness to fight with what they had and to do without what they lacked and to find alternative methods when the methods were unavailable, and German soldiers had delivered on that belief with a consistency and a ferocity that no honest historian has ever denied. But courage is not penicillin. Discipline is not a morphine syrup. The willingness to do without is not a functioning blood bank miles from the front line. And in the end, the men who paid for the difference between what Germany believed its soldiers were worth and what America believed its soldiers were worth were not the generals, or the ministers, or the production planners in Berlin. They were 22-year-old boys from Kaiserslautern with abdominal wounds, lying on stretchers in clearing stations waiting for surgeons who were rationing their ether. In hospitals that had run out of sulfonamide, in a medical system that had been eating itself alive for 2 years before the first American soldier landed in Normandy. There is a final detail in Kessler's report that does not appear in his catalog entries or his technical observati. It appears in a brief paragraph near the beginning, before he begins the systematic room-by-room documentation, almost as if he wrote it on the way in and then disciplined himself back into the formal engineering language for everything that followed. He wrote that when he first entered the farmhouse, before he noticed the rubber matting, before he saw the generators, before he found the supply room, he noticed a smell. He described it carefully, the way an engineer describes something he cannot quite categorize. He said the building smelled of antiseptic and coffee and something else he could not immediately identify. He wrote that it took him several minutes to place the third smell, and that when he placed it he stood still for a moment before continuing into the building. The third smell was soap, clean linen, hot water, the specific, ordinary, civilian smell of a place where people had recently washed with soap and clean water, in a forward medical facility in a combat zone in September of 1944. He did not comment on it further. He moved on to the rubber matting and the generators and the blood bank and the penicillin. He wrote his 37 pages of technical observations and he submitted his report and he went back to the war. But he mentioned the soap. He noticed it enough to write it down. And reading his report 80 years later, in the space between that brief paragraph about the smell and the 37 pages of careful engineering documentation that followed, you can feel the weight of what he did not write. Because the soap was not a medical supply, it was not in his catalog, it was not a technical observation, it was the smell of a system that had thought about everything, that had thought about the rubber matting and the generators and the blood bank and the penicillin. And also, the soap that had understood that a surgeon who operates with clean hands saves more patients than a surgeon who operates without them. That had understood that a nurse who can wash between patients carries less infection from one bed to the next. That had understood that cleanliness was not comfort but medicine, and had built the hot water and the soap into the system the same way it had built in the backup lighting and the drainage channels and the single-use packaging. That was what silenced Werner Kessler inside a captured American field hospital. Not any single thing, the totality of the things, the fact that every problem had been anticipated, that every gap had been filled, that every item presupposed every other item, and every item was there, in the right place, in the right quantity, in the right packaging, ready to be used without preparation or improvisation or alternative methods. A system so complete that even its trash told a story, even its smell told a story. The story it told was the same story that the Sherman tank told, and the Jeep told, and the K-Ration told, and the replacement depot told, and the Red Ball Express told. It was the story of a country that had decided to fight a war the way it built everything else, at scale, with standardization, with the full commitment of its industrial capacity, not just to the weapons that killed but to the systems that kept the people holding those weapons alive. Germany built a military. America built a machine, and somewhere in the difference between those two things, in the gap between alternative methods and 60 ampoules of penicillin in the backup stock, the war was decided, not on any single day, not in any single battle, in 37 pages of an engineer's notebook, written by candlelight in the Netherlands, by a man who had spent 4 hours measuring the distance between what his country had built and what the enemy had built, and who had found, at the end of those 4 hours, that the distance had no bottom. He smelled the soap. He wrote it down. He went back to the war. The war ended 8 months later. The machine was still running. Thank you for watching this story all the way to the end. If it gave you something, a detail you had not considered, a name you had not heard, a way of seeing the war that the standard histories do not show you, alike helps more than you might think. It tells the algorithm that this kind of deep, careful history as an audience. It helps these stories find the people who are looking for them. If you are not subscribed yet, I would be honored if you join this channel. Hit subscribe and the bell so you do not miss what comes next. There are more stories like this one. Stories about the quiet things, the ordinary things, the things that happen behind the battles that most histories never reach. I want to know where you are watching from today. Leave it in the comments. And if someone in your family served in the Second World War, a father, a grandfather, a great uncle, an aunt who nursed or drove or built or coded, tell me about them. These stories belong to the people who lived them and to the families who remember them. I would be honored to hear.